Hello, everyone. My name is Eddie Bolen. I'm the pastor at Midway United Methodist Church. I'm also a pastor at Edgewater United Methodist Church. I want to thank you so much for taking some time out and for clicking on this video. This video is going to be a study that is around Genesis chapter 32, starting at about verse 22, continuing through verse 32. It's a really fascinating story. Genesis is a book of the Bible that is in the Old Testament, is in the Hebrew Scriptures. It is, in fact, in the Bible. It is the first book of the Bible. And if you think it's got to be really old, you're exactly right. This is actually a story of prehistoric significance. It's a prehistory story. So let's go back in time. Let's take a look at Genesis chapter 32. And the reason I wanted to land on this particular story and let us study it together, and I encourage you to do that, you'll notice that at times I'll offer some readings from the scripture. They're going to come from a translation. It's called the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, is the way you'll see it abbreviated many times. And I encourage you to take some time and just look at your own, the kind of translation that you're familiar with. I enjoy in Bible study actually taking a look at multiple translations. So that's the same thing I've done here. But this story, Genesis chapter 32, and particularly starting at verse 22 in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, this has to be one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible. Is Jacob wrestling with an unknown stranger. You may have heard this story before. You may have studied this story before. You say, well, I know who this is. But at the very beginning of this story, that's what I invite you to do. Remember, take that kind of beginner's mind and imagine that you're hearing this story for the very first time. But Jacob wrestles with an unknown stranger in the middle of the night. And that stranger, in fact, does turn out to be God. The entire story is found in Genesis chapter 32, starts at verse 22 through 32, and that is going to be the focus of our study together in this particular video. So I encourage you to do that. Grab a copy of the scripture from me. It's a bound book. That's what I continue to use when I'm studying scripture. But people that are a lot cooler than I am, they can do it in multiple other ways. So if you can do that, I encourage you to do that. But before we dive into Jacob's story, I want to just ask you a question. I want to just kind of give you a question to wrestle with your own self, to kind of consider in your own life. Before we begin, I want you to consider this. If in February of 2020, if going back in February 2020, I want to ask you if you were prepared for a crisis that was going to not only affect you personally, but it is going to affect your family. It is going to affect your job, your career. If you're retired, it's going to affect your pension. It's going to affect your access to the world that is beyond a place where you have determined yourself that this is going to be my safe space. This is going to be a place where I'm going to quarantine. Not only is it going to affect you, but it's going to affect the entire world. So were you ready in February 2020 for that kind of crisis? Would you be ready in, let's say, March of 2022 for that kind of crisis? I mean, what would you have said, completely coming out of this? And I think that you know what I'm alluding to. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the COVID-19 global pandemic. It did, in fact, affect every single one of us. It affected the entire world. But it was, at its very heart, it was a crisis. And so, in other words, how ready are we for a crisis when it comes into our lives? This is what I think this fascinating story of Jacob wrestling with an angel enables us to look at and to study, not only to learn historically and culturally what is happening around Jacob, and we'll talk about that, but also how it affects our own lives, how it affects the kind of crisis that we have in our own lives. The reason why this story of Jacob wrestling, this story of Genesis chapter 32, the reason why this story of Jacob wrestling with God is so famous is because it's about a crisis. And it is also like a laser pointed to how does one person respond in a crisis? So how is it that you are able to respond in a crisis? What is the crisis for Jacob? What is happening before Jacob reaches this place where he is wrestling with this stranger in the middle of the night, and in fact all night until the dawn begins to break? And we'll get into that. Well, if you read before Genesis chapter 32, and if you've watched any videos with me, you'll know that one of the things that I think is extraordinarily important when we come to the scriptures and when we study the scriptures together is context. Context is just taking a look, even a very brief look, but if you have an opportunity, if you have the time, take a more in-depth look, but even a brief look. Look at what happens before the story that you're taking a look at. For example, Genesis chapter 32, look at what happens before. What's going on in Genesis 31. Then look at what happens after, what's happening in Genesis 33. But if you read before Genesis chapter 32 and beyond Genesis chapter 32, if you go beyond that, you will see how Jacob faces the crosses of wrestling and how he experiences this, that it will not only affect him, but it will affect his family and his response. That is, the way that Jacob responds in this particular crisis, in this moment in wrestling with this stranger, is going to result in Jacob's name being completely changed. This is going to be, and his name will be Israel. And Jacob will emerge from this crisis, will emerge from this event as the great patriarch who will have 12 sons, who will become the 12 tribes of Israel and actually become the nation of Israel. Like I said, we are in a world of prehistory. This goes all the way back to the origins and foundations, one of the great gifts that the book of Genesis gives us in the Hebrew Scriptures. The great patriarch of Jacob will become Israel, and his 12 sons, they will become the 12 tribes of Israel. Your own response, just think about this, your own response in crisis will not only affect you, but it affects the people that are around you too. And one of the great things also, and then we'll dive into Genesis 32, but one of the great things that you will see as you study the Hebrew Scriptures, as you study the Old Testament in Genesis, is how active God is in God's creation, the world that God has created, as well as in God's creation of human beings that God has created in God's own image. God is entirely active in the lives of those people that God has created, also in the world that God has created. So, taking a look at Genesis chapter 32, prior to this night of wrestling by Jacob, Jacob and his family are preparing for a reunion with Jacob's brother Esau. And so that's what they've gotten word that they are going to meet together, they are coming together. And there's been conflict throughout, lots of conflict. There's been conflict throughout the two brothers' lives, and Jacob's servants, that is the servants of Jacob's, they have learned that Jacob's brother Esau, in fact, is coming for this reunion, that they are coming together, they are going to meet together, but also what the servants of Jacob have discovered about his brother Esau is that Esau also has with him 400 men that are coming to meet Jacob. This is part of the crisis, a major part of the crisis that is affecting Jacob. So just think about this. There's been some problems in the past between Jacob and his brother. Now he finds out that they're going to have a chance, an opportunity. What Jacob hopes is going to be a reunion, and is going to be a happy reunion. But now what they have found is that the night before, they have found that Esau is coming, in fact is coming, but also has 400 people with him. Now, you will see that this conflict that happens between Jacob and Esau, again, if you want to get a big picture, if you want to know the origin of it, you can turn to Genesis chapter 25. Genesis 25, starting at verse 26, Jacob and Isaac are born. They're twins. And so that is the moment, Genesis chapter 25, verse 26, that is the moment that Jacob and Isaac are born. Genesis chapter 28, if you are familiar at all about Jacob in the Hebrew Scriptures, you may remember, well, isn't Jacob the one that climbed on Jacob's ladder? Yeah, a very beautiful story. In fact, a story that shows a ladder that connects heaven and earth. And what Jacob has this tremendous vision of seeing the way that angels ascend and descend, this up and down movement that is there. But that is also in Genesis chapter 28. So there's a big picture, there's a big story that is happening here, but we're narrowing in on this crisis, on what is happening with Jacob as he prepares to meet his brother Esau. According to Genesis chapter 32, verse 6 through 8, and again, I want to share this with you. I want to read this. It's from the New Revised Standard Version. What Jacob experiences upon hearing about his brother and about his brother that he's going to meet. The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." This again, Genesis chapter 32, verse 6. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him and the flocks and the herds and camels into two companies, thinking, if Esau comes to the one company and destroys it, then the company that is left, then we will escape. So you see, Jacob is afraid, Jacob is distressed, and already you see some of the preparations that Jacob is taking upon himself to meet in this crisis, to meet his brother Esau. He's dividing everything that he owns. He's dividing it in half so that if Esau comes in and if Esau tries to attack what Jacob has, then they'll be able to escape with only part of it. They'll be able to escape with half of it. Jacob, in his fear, Jacob in his distress, will then turn to his servants and will send some gifts by his servants to his brother Esau. Peace offering, sends his gifts to Esau before they meet, on the night before they meet. But also on that same night, Jacob is going to turn to his two wives. This is, again, very ancient story. There's you will come across polygamy in some of the more ancient, not only in the Hebrew scriptures, but throughout the world. You will find this. And so he turns to his two wives, his maids, his children, and sends them across the river. So he's divided everything that he has with him, divided everything that's in his camp. Now he has sent his family away. And so you see this kind of preparation. He's also sent his servants to give this gift to Esau, this kind of peace offering that is there. So you see this little preparation that happens before the crisis that is at hand. What else can Jacob do to prepare? And again, put yourself in this kind of place. What else do we do to prepare when we are afraid and when we are distressed? When you are facing a crisis and it seems that fear and it seems that this kind of distress is overwhelming you, what can you do to prepare for the crisis that is at hand? What kind of spiritual preparation can you do ahead of a crisis like that? You're reading the scriptures, you're studying the scriptures. So where is God involved in that? Where is the Holy Spirit involved in that? Where is Jesus involved in those kinds of crises that you face? This is where Genesis 32 becomes so interesting when Jacob is left alone, particularly that spiritual question. Because what Jacob will do is Jacob will, in fact, wrestle with with a stranger. There are different kind of, and you see me, I've just slipped. There are different kind of orientations, different kind of interpretations that are here, but the scriptures are clear at this point that it is a stranger that Jacob is wrestling with until daybreak. Again, interesting, when the stranger sees that he is unable to prevail, that he is unable to win against Jacob, what the stranger will do is strike Jacob on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip is put out of joint as they continue to wrestle. Now, I want you to think about that. Think about how painful that might be. Think about how painful it might be to have that, that kind of pain that comes to our hips after a fall, that kind of pain if you have had a hip replacement, if you've known someone that you love, friends, family that have had that kind of hip replacement. It can be terrible pain. It can be tremendous pain. But Jacob is wounded, in fact, in this wrestling. He is wounded by the stranger. And there's something else as a mystery in the text, which is, why is it so important to come together and study the scriptures together? Because the stranger says to Jacob, this is again Genesis chapter 32, but the stranger will say to Jacob, let me go, for the day is breaking. The sun's starting to come up. It's starting to be daylight, so let me go, because the day is breaking, no longer covered in darkness. Again, kind of a mystery, and the text is not really clear about what that is. It's left to open for interpretation. It's left open for study, just like what you and I are doing right now in this moment. Jacob refuses. Jacob refuses to let the stranger go until there is a blessing that is given to Jacob. Jacob asks this stranger to give him a blessing. And I want you to pause for a minute. Just pause for a minute. And again, all of us experience some kind of wrestling as the result of some crisis that we endure. I started this in this particular video with COVID-19 because it's kind of a universal crisis that all of us have experienced. It's one of those rare moments that all of us live through the same kind of crisis, and we're still, as much as we're still in the midst of it, there's some kind of wrestling that we're doing collectively, some wrestling that we're doing together as human beings in this world that we live in right now, because it has affected every part of the world. But as we experience, as we go through these crises, what kind of wrestling is involved with us? Have you ever considered the wrestling that you do, and sometimes it's just merely, I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, fear and distress is just trying to survive. It's just trying to get to the next day. Sometimes we may have this kind of insight that comes in a particular crisis, and we think, okay, what can I learn from this? But really, have you ever considered the wrestling that we do in crisis, and have you ever considered that kind of role that God can play in that crisis? Because and in fact, have you ever determined that you are not letting go until you receive a blessing in the middle of that crisis? Not when it's over, not when it has become daylight, when it's no longer darkness, but in the middle of it. I won't let you go, God, until you give me a blessing. I won't let you go in this particular crisis until you give me a blessing. I remember one of the things that we did together as communities at both Midway and Edgewater. We had a virtual spiritual retreat where we came together. We were not, in a place where we were able to meet face-to-face and close with one another. So we had a virtual retreat where we talked about that. We talked about, where is God in the midst of pain? Where is God in the midst of suffering? We kind of wrestled for a little while. We wrestled with that question and came with that question, and actually came to some good blessings that came out of result out of that wrestling that we did together. But some of the questions, in fact, that I'm reflecting on in this story, and that's what I invite you to do, that as you study this story, as you study these scriptures, to ask yourself, what are some of the questions that begin to arise in you? What gets stirred up in you as you're reading and as you're studying this story? Some of the questions that I'm reflecting on in this story is, again, that what does it mean to not let go? What does it mean to not let go when we're wrestling in the middle of a crisis? Also, what about that difference in night and day? That's kind of a mystery that comes up in the story of Genesis chapter 32, in the story of Jacob wrestling the stranger in Genesis 32. And if you're at all interested, there are many myths, there are many legends that have arisen as a result of this story. You can explore many of them further on your own. Jacob is near water. What role does that play? What role does it play that there is water that is present, that is around Jacob on this evening? Also, are there some potential evil forces that are near this water? Some of those get connected. Some of the more ancient legends, some of the more ancient stories that live outside the Bible, I talk about that, talk about the kind of demonic forces that may be associated, connected with water. Also Jacob is kind of in a liminal space. Jacob is, as he begins to wrestle this stranger, then Jacob will... as Jacob begins to wrestle this stranger, then Jacob will ultimately become no longer Jacob, but Israel. He will become, and he will give birth to these 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jacob is in this kind of liminal space of transformation that's taking place. And also Jacob is coming to terms with some of his past actions, some of the places where Jacob has tricked and used trickery to reward himself and to reward his family there. So lots of things that you can discover. But before you leave, I want you to consider this encounter that Jacob has, that Jacob will walk away with a blessing from God and also a limp. Jacob will say that in this space, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. Now, the story of Jacob wrestling with this with God is really a prehistory story. That's where we started. And because it's a prehistory story, it begins to tell us the origins of some things. Because what will happen is that at this place, Jacob will not only take on a new name, not only receive a blessing, but Jacob will change the name of the space where he has been, where the space where he has faced this crisis and faced this wrestling with this stranger who, as Jacob in his own words will say, I've seen God face to face and I've prevailed. The face of God, Peniel, it will be the name of this place. It's literally the face of God. So this space that is here is called Peniel, the face of God. Also, we are revealed because it's an ancient story, prehistory story. This tells us why Jacob walks with a limp. Why does Jacob have a limp? Because this is what happened when he wrestled with God. Also reveals why the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle at the hip socket in a kosher diet. Genesis 32:32 says this, and again, think about this prehistory story. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. And so he reveals why Israel does not eat the thigh muscle, why that is part of a kosher diet. But as we come to an end of our Bible study together, I just want to invite you to continue to wrestle in your own self as you study the scriptures together. And particularly the story of Genesis chapter 32 is a fascinating story, but there is much fruit that can lead us all to grow in our own spiritual lives together. But in any crisis that comes to us, there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity to wrestle with God in the middle of that crisis and discover, if we hang on to God, that there are blessings to be experienced, and blessings that have the potential to forever change us, blessings that in fact have the potential to change the world. And also that kind of crisis, that kind of wrestling, it could even change the way that we eat, the kind of food that we eat. Well, I hope that is enough to inspire you and to encourage you to dig into the scriptures. Take a look at Genesis chapter 32. Take a look at this story of Jacob wrestling with God, and the place where Jacob says, this is a place where I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. Well, thanks again for taking some time and for studying the scriptures. And may God's blessings be upon you, and may God's blessings be with you as you face and as you go through any crisis that is on your plate. Thanks so much for watching.